Here today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our November Center for Archival Futures, aka Cafe Talk. I'm Jessica Grimmer, and together with my colleague Diana Marsh, we serve as the co-directors of Cafe. Cafe was established in 2021 as a group of interdisciplinary researchers from the iSchool and beyond, whose work intersects at the crossroads of archives and digital curation, very broadly conceived. We are interested in the systems, processes, and institutions that care for and enable the use of archives, digital objects, and data over time. The various projects that fall under Cafe's umbrella take a wide range of human-centered approaches to understanding topics, including archives and data in communities, knowledge ecosystems, and data life cycles. This speaker series is our flagship event, usually held on the first Wednesday of each month during the semester. And we're here together with you on this first Wednesday of November. We host speakers who are at the cutting edge of archives and digital curation, research, and practice. You can find recordings of our previous events at the Cafe event page link, which is pasted in the chat. All right, I will hand things over at this point to Diana.
Welcome, everyone. It's great to see a great Zoom crowd here. I'm Diana Marsh. I'm assistant professor in archives and digital curation here. And want to start by acknowledging that we're beaming in from College Park, Maryland, which is on the ancestral territories of the Piscataway and Nacotchtank and their indigenous kin and neighbors. And that as members of the University of Maryland, we acknowledge the 202,000 acres of native land stolen and distributed to the university under the Morrill Act in 1862. And you'll see a great link to a previous MLIS student and museum studies student project that highlights some of those documents, and also I recommend the land grab project if you're interested in looking more broadly at all of the other land grant institutions and all of the native land they've profited off of. And we want to acknowledge the separation that those and all the other acts of colonialism and assimilation and genocide generated between Indigenous peoples and homelands, and honor and thank our Indigenous colleagues for the collaborative work that's happening now and the patience with which Indigenous colleagues continue to collaborate with colonial institutions like ours. And I'd also like to plug for local work that's happening in this space. The Akakik Foundation is doing amazing work to do all kinds of, especially environmental and cultural reclamation and teaching and community work in Maryland. So I recommend to take a look at the Akakik Foundation or donate if you have the means. And further, we want to acknowledge the University of Maryland's connection to slavery and to generations of racialized trauma at the institution. As a member college of the university's Studying Slavery Initiative, UMD has undertaken the 1856 project, which is committed to illuminating that history. And we're really proud that the 1856 project here is held through our special collections and university archives, and really centers the way that archives can sort of tell those stories and bring all of us together to talk about those histories. So take a look at the 1856 project to learn more. And now I'll hand it over to Amanda Sorensen for our introduction.
Hey everyone, my name is Amanda Sorensen. I'm a PhD candidate here in the iSchool, and it is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Nathan Sowry. When the Smithsonian is open, Dr. Sowry is the reference archivist at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, and he has worked in this position since 2016. Dr. Sowry holds a BA in Anthropology and Religious Studies from the University of Pittsburgh, an MA in History from Washington State University, and an MLIS degree in Archives and Records Management from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also a PhD in History from American University. He has published in archival issues in the Middle Ground Journal with a research focus on archival description and education and identifying resistance to colonialism in the archival record. So today, Dr. Sowry's presentation will focus on his new book entitled Turning the Power: Indian Boarding Schools, Native American Anthropologists, and the Race to Preserve Indigenous Cultures, which results from his dissertation work. This research follows 10 Native American students through forced indoctrination in Indian boarding schools and how they resisted racist assimilation as adults. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sowry.
Thank you, everyone. Let me make sure I can share my screen. Can people see that? Hopefully. Yep, I got a thumbs up. And let's see if I can do this. Okay, so I'm going to stop my video so people don't have to stare at me the whole time. Stop video. Okay, but people can still hear me, I'm hoping. Okay, so I wanted to obviously thank Amanda Sorensen for the intro, and Dr. Jessica Grimmer and Dr. Diana Marsh at the University of Maryland College Park for organizing this event. And of course, I want to thank everyone for attending this book talk. I really appreciate everybody's interest. Okay, I'd like to begin by providing a vignette into the lives of one of these important but relatively unknown Native American anthropologists. Before each performance, Florence Shotridge entered a small, temporarily vacant room in Philadelphia's University Museum. There she would transform herself. She regularly shed the garments of many urban women of her day, replacing them with a buckskin Plains Indian-style dress. To this, she added moccasins, bracelets, and a necklace. Finally, she placed a headband with a single feather atop her head, complementing her long, straight, dark hair. When she was done, there was no sign of Florence's life in 1912 Philadelphia. Instead, she had transformed herself into something reminiscent of picturesque 1880s Lakota Sioux culture. With her costume complete, Florence greeted her audience of schoolchildren eager to learn about Native American histories and cultures. Marketed by the museum as a, quote, Indian princess, Florence embodied a stereotype of Native American life. She personified what many museum goers imagined Indigenous life to be and what, quote, real Indians looked like. In appearance, she became a horse-riding, feather headdress-wearing, teepee-inhabiting woman of the Great Plains. In this, she mirrored many Native people who performed in Buffalo Bill's popular Wild West shows. Although none of the schoolchildren in Philadelphia's University Museum would have noticed, the glass beads Florence habitually wore around her neck belied her supposed Plains Indian heritage. This necklace was of Russian manufacture and an heirloom passed down to Florence from her Tlingit grandmother. Rather than being a modern Minnehaha or an Indian princess of the American Great Plains, as the newspapers reported, Florence in reality came from much further west than many in her audience ever imagined. In the photograph seen here, the image on the left is of Florence taken in 1900 when she was approximately 17 years old, living in Alaska. The image on the right was taken a dozen years later and portrays Florence as Philadelphia museum audiences would have seen her. Florence was born in approximately 1882 or 1883 in Chilkoot in the Alaska Territory. In the historical record, she is known by many names, including Mary Dennis, Susie Skundu, Florence Dennis, Katwaxni, and Katkawaxni. She was the daughter of the powerful and respected Tlingit healer Skundu. After great persistence, Skundu, along with other Tlingit leaders, eventually permitted Presbyterian missionaries led by S. Hall Young to settle in the Cliquan-Haines area in the late 19th century. There, the missionaries quickly built schools to disseminate their Christian beliefs. Photographs in the middle and on the right of the screen depict Florence's father Skundu, missionary S. Hall Young, and the village of Cliquan in 1895. Florence was one of many Alaska Native schoolchildren to attend the Presbyterian Mission School in Haines, seen here in the photograph on the left. She would ultimately spend 4 years there under missionary tutelage. Like other survivors of mission and Indian boarding schools, Florence's schooling was full of racist declarations about the backwardness of her history, language, and culture. Fortunately for her, Florence also had the good fortune to receive instruction outside of the school walls. From her female relatives, she learned beadwork, basket weaving, and Chilkat blanket weaving. On the screen are photographs of blanket weaving and one of the Chilkat robes woven by Florence. In 1902, Florence married fellow Chilkat Tlingit community member and Indian boarding school survivor Louis Shotridge. He is seen here in the image on the lower right. The two would spend the next 15 years side by side. During that time, they traveled across the country repeatedly, mingled in anthropological circles, and worked in Indian fairs. They also sang on vaudeville stages, lectured to museum audiences, and even conducted the first native-led anthropological expedition to Alaska. Opportunities for Indigenous peoples on and off of reservations were rare. As we will see, Florence and Louis did what they could to teach others about their culture. They accomplished this despite often being relegated to stereotypes of how non-native audiences expected, quote, real Indians to look. Florence and Louis caught the traveling bug within a year of their marriage. In 1903, by happy coincidence, Alaska's territorial governor visited the Klukwan-Haines area. After seeing Florence's weaving skills, the governor invited her to attend the upcoming 1905 Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, or World's Fair, in Portland, Oregon. There she would demonstrate her art as well as showcase her Tlingit culture to fairgoers. The 23-year-old Florence jumped at this opportunity, and her young husband Louis eagerly agreed to accompany her. Recognizing the public's desire for native-made objects, the ever-savvy Louis brought with him several dozen items of Tlingit manufacture for sale. One of his customers ended up being George Byron Gordon of Philadelphia's University Museum, who was in Portland on a collecting trip. Gordon is pictured in the image above, sporting some dapper and pointy facial hair. Florence, Louis, and Gordon quickly became friends. This would eventually pay off because years later, Gordon would play a major role in the anthropology careers of this young couple. Another individual Florence and Louis met at the 1905 World's Fair would also play a big part in their future careers. This was the duplicitous Antonio Apache seen in the photograph on the right. In 1906, Antonio Apache opened his Indian Crafts Exposition in what is now Lincoln Park in Los Angeles, California. Apache gathered native basket makers, blanket weavers, silversmiths, artists, and canoe builders into a self-supporting anthropological village where they would live and work. This was similar to many Indian villages constructed at World's Fairs across the nation at this time. In these manufactured villages, non-native visitors would watch Indigenous people make their wares and could purchase the finished products for a small fee. The proceeds from these sales were the livelihood of the native artists, as well as for Apache as the manager of the Indian Crafts Exposition. Newspapers proclaimed it one of the most interesting and expansive ethnological displays in the country, rivaling anthropology museums in the Midwest and East Coast. At Antonio Apache's invitation, Florence and Louis ended up working and living there for the bulk of the exposition's existence, from 1906 until 1911. The image on the left-hand side is from the 1910 federal census. The inset detail lists Antonio Apache and the Shotridges as employees of the Indian Crafts Exposition living in the Indian village in Los Angeles. Of course, it was also during these years that Antonio Apache's supposed native heritage came into question. Newspapers across the country reported in 1907 that Apache was not a member of the White Mountain Apache community from Arizona, as he claimed. Instead, many argued that Apache was in fact a Louisiana-born black man by the name of Tony Simpson. While Apache claimed until his dying breath that he was indeed native, everything today points to the man being an imposter. He used his appropriated cultural identity for financial and professional advantage while excluding qualified Indigenous peoples from anthropological opportunities. While the photograph on the right shows Antonio Apache in typical Euro-American clothing, the center photograph portrays him as he was more often seen by audiences. Here he appears making, quote, authentic jewelry from his purported southwestern homeland. No evidence exists to suggest Florence and Louis knew Apache's true identity. While their ultimate reason for leaving remains unclear, We know that in 1911, the Shotridges packed up and left Apache's Indian Crafts Exposition in Los Angeles. Soon after leaving, Florence and Lewis joined the cast of a popular native theater company managed by a woman known in the media as Mademoiselle Tuna. Her real name was Matilda Coots Johnston, and her specialty as a manager was selecting and training native entertainers to sing grand opera in the original French, German, and Italian languages. This she combined with popular Native American dances and songs for the audience's enjoyment. She can be seen in the postcard image here, flanked by Florence and Lewis, along with other members of the opera company. Mademoiselle Tuna arranged for the Shotridges to take music and English lessons during their time with her theater troupe. Additionally, they and the other native performers wore Plains Indian clothing while on stage, meeting audience expectations of how real Indians should look. The shows were a wild success, with the Indian Grand Opera Company traveling from city to city back and forth across the country. Despite receiving much acclaim in the theater arena, Florence and Lewis's association with Mademoiselle Tuna did not last long. They still wanted to make a move into serious anthropology work to preserve the beauty and richness of their culture. Fortunately for them, their old friend George Byron Gordon had some positions waiting for them at Philadelphia's University Museum. As previously noted, the Shotridges met Gordon years earlier at the 1905 Portland World's Fair when he was doing collecting work there. Since that time, Gordon had risen through the ranks of the Philadelphia Museum, eventually becoming its director in 1911. Having maintained his connection with Florence and Lewis, Gordon invited them to become a part of his staff. Particularly popular in those days at the museum were lectures geared towards children. When possible, these presentations were led by Native museum employees. Regardless of their heritage and geographic region, these Indigenous staff members would dress in Plains Indian clothing to appeal to school classes visiting the museum. Often labeled princesses and chiefs, these Native women and men danced, sang songs, and spoke about Indigenous cultures and lifeways. Florence and Lewis quickly took on these roles. Displayed here are images of museum visitors admiring an exhibition and a newspaper clipping lauding the Shotridges' work in the museum. On the right, Lewis and Florence are seen surrounded by school children. While the museum conferred upon Lewis the title of curatorial assistant, Florence, being a woman and an Indigenous woman at that, became instead an Indian princess. This despite the fact that she possessed the same qualifications as her husband. Although we don't know Florence's thoughts about this type of work, we know she wowed museum audiences. She built on earlier performances with Antonio Apache's Indian Village and Mademoiselle Tuna's Indian Grand Opera Company. Florence once again reprised her role as an Indian princess dressed in Plains Indian clothing, and audiences loved it. A reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer described her in a 1912 newspaper article as, quote, a real Indian clad in buckskin and beads. Note the center photograph of Florence and Lewis in stereotyped clothing. Nor was Florence alone in being pigeonholed into the role of an Indian princess. Numerous other Native women of this era found employment on stage and in museums depicting caricatures of Native American life. 3 of Florence's contemporaries worked at New York's American Museum of Natural History at the same time. These women included Princess Wadawaso, also known as Lucy Nicolar, a Penobscot woman, Princess Chinquilla, also known as Mary Newell, a Southern Cheyenne woman, and Princess Teata, also known as Mary Frances Thompson, a Chickasaw woman. Despite their varied cultural backgrounds, each of them dressed in Plains Indian clothing, performed songs and dances for audiences, and were dubbed Indian princesses. Seen here are museum booklets from the 1920s in New York listing some of their upcoming performances. These women all shared something else in common, though. They each used their celebrity status to speak out about injustice in Indian country and to advocate for Native American sovereignty. Lucy Nicolar pushed for Penobscot voting rights in her home state of Maine. In New York, Mary Newell organized an aid society for American Indians living in the city. And more broadly, after her days as an Indian princess, Mary Frances Thompson later toured the world championing Native American cultures on a global scale. But Florence and Lewis weren't known only for their performances in Plains Indian clothing at the Philadelphia Museum. They did much more than dress up as stereotyped real Indians. Largely unprecedented for Native Museum employees, they interpreted, arranged, and described Northwest Coast collections. They even created miniature models of Tlingit villages for exhibition, one of which is pictured here. In addition to lecturing and creating exhibits, they also published about their culture, including articles they wrote for the museum's scholarly journal. The article on the left is titled Indians of the Northwest, written by Florence and Lewis. On the right is Florence's solo article titled The Life of a Chilkat Indian Girl. Both articles were published by the Philadelphia Museum in 1913. Sorry, needed a drink of water. During these days, they befriended a number of leading non-Native anthropologists. In addition to George Byron Gordon at the Philadelphia Museum, they worked closely with Mark Raymond Harrington, Alanson Skinner, and Frank Speck. In 1914 and 1915, Florence and Lewis even lived briefly in New York, taking up temporary quarters on West 121st Street near Columbia University. There they worked with Franz Boas on linguistics, eventually producing a Tlingit grammar of their language. A photograph of Franz Boas, later dubbed the father of American anthropology, is in the center of the screen. On the right are images of the collaborative grammar he and the Shotridges co-wrote. As we've seen, Florence and Lewis were very involved in museum and anthropology work. Their next step, the one they'd been waiting for, was to conduct ethnographic fieldwork in Alaska among their own community. They hoped to study their culture through their own eyes, and they wanted to explain their culture through their own voices. As Native anthropologists under the aegis of the Philadelphia Museum, they would be able to portray their community themselves, rather than their history and lifeways being interpreted by outsiders, as had previously been done. In June 1915, Florence and Lewis led a collecting expedition on behalf of Philadelphia's University Museum to the Northwest Coast and Alaska. As they were the first Native-led wife and husband anthropological expedition, their work was wholly unprecedented. Once again, newspaper reporters scrambled to tell their story. Numerous news stories about the, quote, civilized Indians who explored the wilds of Alaska popped up in the press. One such newspaper clipping can be seen here on the left, juxtaposed with a 21st century photograph of Chilkoot Lake in Alaska. From their home base in the village of Haines, Alaska, Florence and Lewis spent the next 2 years attending potlatches, writing observations, and recording Tlingit songs on wax cylinders with a phonograph machine. They also wrote down the songs and beliefs of their people, while simultaneously acquiring countless Northwest Coast objects and material culture belongings that they shipped to the Philadelphia Museum. Note the center photograph of the house where the Shotridges lived in Haines. On the right are genealogical and linguistic notes they collected. Sadly, their collaborative fieldwork ended abruptly in June 1917. Florence had been sick since the previous summer, but things had gotten progressively worse in recent months. Despite what comfort and aid Lewis and her community members could offer, Florence passed away on June 12, 1917, from tuberculosis. She spent her last moments surrounded by friends and family in her native land. 3 days later, Florence was buried in a cemetery along Chilkoot Lake, not far from where she and Lewis first attended school together at the Presbyterian Mission in Haines. For 12 years, the two had crisscrossed the country, performing as entertainers and working as anthropologists. And now it had all come to a sudden end. Florence had just started her most rewarding work when she died in 1917 at age 35. Correspondence between Lewis and Philadelphia Museum staff regarding her death are included here, along with a newspaper clipping lamenting her passing. Jobs for Native women in the early days of U.S. anthropology were often few, far between, and socially constrained by gender. Despite often being relegated to overlooked collaborators and Indian princesses, a handful of Native women successfully fought to escape these confining roles. Women such as Ella Cara Deloria, Gladys Tantaquidgeon, and Florence Shotridge broke down the barriers before them and created new spaces as anthropologists in their own right. We don't know what else Florence may have accomplished had she not died so young. No doubt she would have created a more permanent place for herself and other Native women within museum anthropology. Inevitably, Florence would have continued to educate people about the diversity, beauty, and rich histories of the indigenous nations of North America. Finally, if she had lived longer, perhaps she also would have tempered her husband's questionable collecting practices that later earned him the antipathy of his people. Of course, due to time constraints, we can't really get into Lewis's collecting here, but for anyone interested, you can learn more about Lewis and many other Native anthropologists in my book. Florence and Lewis Shotridge were just two among untold numbers of Indian boarding school survivors. The enforced assimilation at these schools is best seen in the images shown here. On the left is an 1882 photograph of Diné Navajo community member Tom Torlino when he first arrived at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. The photo on the right was taken 3 years later, shortly before departing the school. These before and after photographs were used by Carlisle founder Richard Henry Pratt to show the supposed good work he and his staff were doing. In Pratt's infamous words, his goal for students like Tom Torlino was to, quote, kill the Indian in him and save the man. Pratt and other Indian boarding school staff sought to eradicate everything Native about these students. They wanted them to assimilate to Euro-American Christian society and abandon their cultures. All of these students faced daily racism for being members of a supposedly lesser race. They were taught that their cultures were backward, their histories primitive, their languages barbaric, and their religions blasphemous. But in addition to the heart-rending racism and abuse these children endured, they also learned lessons from each other that their teachers did not anticipate. They learned their cultures were rich, their histories a source of pride, their languages beautiful, and their religions something to be honored, not discarded. Through the devastating experiences of their boarding school days, these Native women and men learned to speak, read, and write in English, making them ideal candidates to work in the new anthropological profession. With the photographs seen here, I challenged the before and after student photos made popular at the Carlisle Indian Boarding School. On the left is an image of Southern Arapaho anthropologist Cleaver Worden in his youth at Carlisle in 1884. Appearing assimilated. However, in the middle photograph taken 14 years later, Worden has re-embraced his culture, largely rejecting the assimilationist teachings from boarding school. Here he is seen wearing clothing and holding items from his Southern Arapaho community. Personally, I found the juxtaposition of these two images so powerful that I chose them to be on the cover of my book, seen here on the right side of the screen. The contrast of young Cleaver Worden at Carlisle and older Cleaver Worden in Southern Arapaho dress perfectly illustrates how some Indian boarding school survivors re-embrace their cultures despite attempts to assimilate them. Clearly, this contrast of the before and after images of Cleaver Worden is the obverse of the more popular before and after student photos like those we just saw of Tom Torlino. These images of Worden's decision to return to his heritage after being forced to endure assimilation in his youth disrupts the supposed good assimilation work heavily promoted by Carlisle founder and staunch assimilation advocate Richard Henry Pratt. In this book, I highlight the lives of Cleaver Worden, Florence Shotridge, and 8 other Native individuals who were instrumental in the development of early U.S. anthropology. Sadly, all of them have largely been left out of the anthropological literature. If their names are mentioned at all, they appear simply as footnotes. My goal with this book is to restore identity and humanity to 10 of these boarding school survivors who represented their Indigenous communities in museum exhibitions, in publications, and on a variety of public stages. In greater or lesser degrees, each of them found ways to confront settler colonialism and undermine federal assimilation policies created to eliminate their ways of life. Fortunately for their communities and for us, these Indian boarding school survivors didn't succumb to the dominant rhetoric of racism and assimilation. Instead, they turned the power against a settler colonial world that used every weapon in its arsenal to erase their cultures. By turning the power, these Native individuals used their negative experiences in boarding schools to produce positive results. They chose not to discard their Native identities, cultures, communities, and languages, as they had been taught to do. Instead, they embraced these things. While these Native anthropologists strove to present non-Native audiences with an accurate record of their people, they also worked for something more. They each sought to create a lifeline for future generations of their own communities, for future generations who hopefully wouldn't live in a world where their histories and cultures were constantly under attack. By retelling the life stories of these largely unrecognized Native anthropologists, we humanize them and acknowledge the work they did to preserve their cultures. It is only a little step, perhaps, but it is a step in the right direction. As far as conducting research, I scoured archives across the nation to piece together the lives of these Native anthropologists. Some of the many different archival sources I used included anthropological field notes, diaries and journals, boarding school records, newspapers, Indian census rolls, state and federal census rolls, marriage licenses, correspondence, oral histories from family members, photographs, and government publications, among others. I also include here a list of the many repositories I visited in person and online to conduct this research. Excuse me. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my debt to Native scholar Dr. Clifford Trafser, Professor of American Indian Affairs at UC Riverside, for introducing me to the phrase turning the power. As Dr. Trafser wrote in his book Boarding School Blues, Indian boarding school students use the potentially negative experience to produce a positive result: the preservation of Indian identity, cultures, communities, languages, and peoples. My book seeks to expand upon Dr. Trafser's initial work. Additionally, I couldn't have accomplished all of this without the help and encouragement of my wife, Leslie, and the many colleagues, friends, and family members who are too numerous to list here. Finally, I wanted to add some photos of our felines, Pierogi and Paprika. As I note in my book's dedication, since day one, they both kept me company, assuring me that the best seats in the house were somehow always on my keyboard and notes. If interested, you're welcome to order your own copy of Turning the Power through the publisher's QR code on the screen. Additionally, if you enter the code seen here, you will save 40% off, because we all know the high prices of scholarly academic works. And now, if there are any questions or criticisms, I'm welcome to them.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nathan.
Yeah, you got it. Happy to speak a whole lot.
So we do typically ask our students if there's a student with the first question, particular any of our archive students who have questions, we highly encourage them. Oh, we got a first one in the chat here. Okay, so I'll just, Jess, you want me to read this one out? Okay, so hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I have a question on your archival research. What barriers did you run into in your archival research? Did you ever have issues with the erasure of specifics, native identity in the places you were searching that made it more difficult to study the lives of these people?
Yes, yes, there were lots of barriers. Um, so with I'd say 8 of the 10 Indian boarding school survivors that I portray in this book, 8 of them, their personal correspondence with anthropologists, with family members, with others is available in archives. With 2 of them, with both Florence Shotridge and a gentleman by the name of Titchkamatsi, who was one of the first Native people to work at the Smithsonian, um, there's almost no personal correspondence from either of them, despite both of them being, literate and able to write. So that was a big barrier just as far as trying to understand their motivations, their personal thoughts. I did my best, obviously, like I said, I scoured kind of archives and materials everywhere to try to understand everything about their lives. But I guess the biggest barrier I found was it is erasure, but I don't even know how intentional it was for a lot of these native anthropologists. I mean, on the part of others, I don't think that erasure was necessarily intentional as much as there just isn't much in the historical record for some of them. But I should note, it's really important to say that with the other 8 native anthropologists whose correspondence I had access to, um, their correspondence in most cases is written to non-native anthropologists, and there's clear, power struggles there that you can't ignore. So even though I had their personal correspondence and that felt like a window into their motivations, um, everything has to be read against the grain because they're writing this to an audience that is hierarchically in power above them and employing them. So I don't want to say that I necessarily understood everything they were doing, but from everything I could gather, newspaper clippings and photos and correspondence and publications, all of that, I tried to humanize all of these people as well as I could, despite there being some huge barriers. All of them have passed away, nearly a century ago, and being a non-native scholar living in the 21st century in DC, it's tough to make those connections. But yeah,
And I want to take host privilege and ask a follow-up question, which is,
sure.
did your knowledge of archives, being a reference archivist yourself and
Mhm.
knowing sort of some of the ins and outs of different institutions or knowing archivists at those places, did that facilitate any of those sort of archival searches, or like, was there a role to play in sort of your own archival work, or any lessons learned as you're now, when you are back in your own role as a
Yeah.
reference archivist?
Yes, it definitely definitely aided my research. Just a shout out to Rose Buchanan at National Archives and Records Administration. She's a reference archivist there and works really closely with the Bureau of Indian Affairs records, which most of the Indian boarding school materials are kind of subsumed under Bureau of Indian Affairs records. So Rose was a huge help. Obviously I would have reached out to National Archives staff anyway, but having that connection with her, with Brian Carpenter at American Philosophical Society, I mean, I could name everybody, but having done a lot of reference work in the past and research work, it definitely did help to already have a good feel for where these materials were. Um, but I should point out, as I said, that a lot of these native anthropologists were only footnotes in the anthropological literature. The reason I came across them was when I was doing my dissertation work, looking at more of an all-encompassing look at the history of anthropology and native representation. Um, I just kept coming across these same names, and they'd only be footnotes. But I'm like, there's got to be more about these individuals who played a really important role. So the fact that I enjoy doing research and that I'm passionate about the lives of these people definitely helped me to do research, but it was still a lot of digging and, years spent poring over manuscripts and photos.
I just want to confirm that I checked both of the giant tomes that are recent publications on Fran Boas, and none of these folks are in the index.
Yeah, that sounds about right, unfortunately. Well, hopefully my book changes that a bit.
Let me see. We've got so many questions pouring in. I'm going to take one from the chat and then we'll go to Eric's class. And thank you all for joining. Let me see. This is from Aaron Cantor. Hi, Nate. Thank you for your talk. Are there any differences in the anthropologic research produced by white scholars versus the native scholars you highlight in your book? Is that part of how they turn the power, not just articulating their own and their community's experiences, but also qualitative or methodological differences in their research?
Wow, Aaron's always throwing the tough ones at me. Yes, there are notable differences when you look at the publications and material produced by the native anthropologist and the non-native anthropologist at the same time, looking at them, in the early 20th century. There's huge differences. For instance, a lot of the native anthropologists were correcting inaccurate depictions of ceremonies, of items, of their people, of everything, where non-native anthropologists were saying, this is why this community does this, and this is what they believe. And so, someone like Florence Shotridge would say, that's not what we do at all. Who told you that? And I'd say as an employee at the Smithsonian working at NMAI with Indigenous communities, that's something that we're still doing every single day, is all of these legacy catalog descriptions and inaccurate photo descriptions. We as staff at the NMAI are working with Indigenous communities to correct that record. In archival terms, we call it reparative description, but basically, yes, there are still a lot of inaccuracies and racist depictions that were, we, as in myself and other archivists, but primarily Indigenous communities, are working with us to correct those. I don't know how well that answers Aaron's question, but yes, there are notable differences between the work being produced by native scholars and non-native.
All right, Eric's class. I see show him here if you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thank you for a really great talk. I was wondering, I'm sure there's a lot of research and things that you had to filter out that didn't fit into the book as you were developing the narrative for it. I'm curious what your process of deciding what to keep versus not keep looked like, and are there things that you wish you had more room to include in the book?
Fortunately, the staff at University of Nebraska Press and their reviewers were really lenient with me, I guess. They allowed me to kind of keep talking as I'm doing here. They allowed me to keep writing. But as Amanda mentioned in the introduction, that this was kind of an outgrowth of my dissertation, it was, 450 some ridiculous pages and very academic jargon. So to try to make this a little more accessible to everybody, and to make it enjoyable as opposed to encyclopedic reading, I did have to cut out a lot. But as far as stuff I'd like to have in there, these 10 native anthropologists that I talk about aren't the only native anthropologists. There were dozens and dozens of people that the field used to refer to as informants, who were supplying this information. And because of the length of my book, but also the scarcity of other resources, I could only talk about 10 of them. I want to do more research into another 20 people that I would love to include. And I do mention in the intro to my book that the people I look at, there are 9 male native anthropologists and 1 female native anthropologist, and that's not accurate. There were women everywhere, Native women supplying this information to their husbands, to non-Native anthropologists. And I wish so much that I could find more information on some of those female Native anthropologists who have also been written out of the record or excluded altogether. But again, trying to find sources for that is really difficult. And I'm hoping by, the work that I published, hopefully others can build on that and talk more about, Native female anthropologists and others who have been kind of written out of the record.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to go down to our next question that's in the chat, and this is from Maria. She says, thank you so much for your presentation. You mentioned how turning the power and its definition was provided to you. Did the definition evolve as you continued your own research while learning more about these 10 individuals? Were there any of the anthropologists you particularly grew attached to as you continued your research?
That's a wonderful question. It kind of it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. There's only so much that myself as a non-native scholar in 21st century US can relate to these individuals, or that I should try to argue that I'm relating to them, because I don't think that's my place in a lot of situations. But I several of the anthropologists I really, really liked. A few of them I learned to not like as much when I was reading through their personal correspondence. But that's some of the choices they made in what to collect and but as far as the title "Turning the Power," it was actually more of a really lucky happenstance where I was already writing this. I knew what I wanted to say. I had a terrible title that I won't even mention here, but I was trying to find a good title for it and had come across Clifford Trafser's work, and Turning the Power was exactly what I was trying to say, and I just didn't know that that already existed out there. And so yeah, it wasn't like finding the title and saying, yeah, that's what I'll build off of. It was just really fortuitous that after writing the bulk of this and rewriting it several times, then I came across that work of his, and I'm like, oh, well, that's what I'm saying. It is turning the power. That's what these Indian boarding school students did. So sorry, I don't know if I could list one individual Native anthropologist that I enjoyed them all. I really did. They're fascinating individuals, and I do want to emphasize that regardless of some of the negative effects and consequences of them collecting this cultural heritage and it now existing in museums, despite that, most all of them were doing this work for laudable reasons. They really thought they were saving their cultures. They just weren't aware of some of the bad effects that would have, robbing cultural history from their own communities.
Here's another question from the chat, and this is from Heather Salter. Nathan, this is just fabulous, and I'm so excited to read the whole book. This may not be a fair question, but it interests me as a world historian and historian of empire. Do you know if anyone has undertaken similar work as this for other locations where children were separated from their parents and communities, i.e. in Canada or Australia?
I can't think of the scholars' names at the moment. But yeah, I know there was a study a couple of years ago specifically about assimilation, enforced assimilation from colonial governments in, I can't remember if it was New Zealand or Australia, but doing a comparison with US. And I know there's been a lot of work with children separated by enforced assimilation and boarding schools in both the US and Canada, where other scholars have done kind of comparative work. Unfortunately, I can't think of their names right now. But Dr. Salter was the chair of my master's thesis, so she wants to throw out some difficult questions for me too.
All right. Well, always great to have our chairs revisit
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
All All right, this is coming from Allison Singer in the chat. She says, I'm curious about whether Dr. Sowry believes that there were any common experiences that enabled these 10 survivors to turn the power.
I guess I'd ask for clarification. I mean, the common experiences were not only the enduring the racism and abuse where they were told that their cultures were, backward and primitive, but also the fact that they went back home and then re-embraced their cultures and said, like, no, this is important. This shouldn't be discarded. I mean, I guess if you're asking more, why didn't some other boarding school survivors turn to this? I think because anthropology was just a beginning discipline at the time, it was less exclusive, where, later as it became professionalized, there weren't as many Native people involved, there weren't as many white women involved, but in its early days, it was a bit more inclusive. So I think these 10 boarding school survivors gravitated towards that. But as I also mentioned, there were so few opportunities. I don't know if any of these Native anthropologists, I think few of these Native anthropologists wanted to say, yes, I love anthropology. I think they found a lot of problems with the anthropological field and with non-Native anthropologists, but it was an opportunity to earn an income and also to correct the record and say, look, people are saying a bunch of stuff that simply isn't true about our communities. Sorry, I'm not sure if that answers that well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that answer. Let me see if there's any response. Yes, and Allison says thank you.
Great.
So let me see. On to another question from the chat. Wow, just like also bravo everyone in the chat for such great engagement.
I like that.
Let me see. I'm scrolling through here. Let me see. This comes from Paula Kane. Since some of the natives that you profile ended up performing, with scare quotes, at venues like World's Fair and cultural exhibitions, did any of them cross paths with Wild Bill Cody and his Wild West show, which was active from the 1880s until his death in 1917? Did he ever try to recruit any of them?
Really interesting. A number of them have interactions with Buffalo Bill. One of, I guess, to answer an earlier question about did I find more of a connection with one of the individuals, Richard Davis, I won't go into him now, but he's fascinating, where he was one of the first students at Carlisle, spent the longest time there. He ended up being there for 14 years. After he finished school, he and his wife and children lived on the campus, and he was basically a star pupil of Richard Henry Pratt, and he really advocated for assimilation. And it wasn't until he left Carlisle, goes back to Oklahoma, and he's like, all of this was wrong, all of this was wrong. But he ends up working in a competitor. I'm forgetting the name of the Wild West show, but there were a lot of competitors of Buffalo Bill that Richard Davis worked for. And fascinatingly, he later abandons everything, even his Euro-American name, Richard Davis, and stars not only on vaudeville and with the Mademoiselle Tuna's Indian Grand Opera Company, but later stars in some of the earliest Western films in like 1914, 1915. Unfortunately, he's always depicted in a very stereotyped costume, just like Buffalo Bill. And that goes back to the audience expectation of what, quote, real Indians are supposed to look like. But yes, Buffalo Bill did seek out Indian boarding school survivors because they could speak and read and write in English, and that just helped everything with the performances. So
amazing. Thank you. Thank you. And we've got two questions from Eric. One, were these anthropologists remembered in their own communities? And two, whoops, so many people jumping in here. I'm losing the thread. And two, were the anthropologists hired as anthropologists by museums, or did they enter through a different way, such as portraying Indian princesses?
Um, sorry, the first part of the question,
The first
which I'm
part,
already blanking
were
out.
these anthropologists remembered in their own communities?
Right. Um, yes, a lot of them are, but I don't think many people in those communities today realize how much information these native anthropologists produced. Like James Murray, for instance, who was Pawnee. Um, his field notes are some of them are at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, but a lot of them are at the Field Museum in Chicago, and they were left unpublished. There's just, hundreds and hundreds of pages about grammar and ceremonial information and creation stories. So a lot of these anthropologists, yes, a lot of these native anthropologists are remembered by their communities, but I don't think a lot of people realize how much information these individuals produced for their communities. And for a number of reasons, after their death, the non-native anthropologists decided to stop. So basically to say there's a lot of information out there. But in some communities like Lewis Shotridge, I had mentioned, earned the antipathy of his Tlingit Chilkat people in Alaska. I think that's starting to change a little bit, but yeah, in a lot of communities, some of these individuals are looked at more as villains or traitors who were willing to sell their culture as opposed to willing to preserve it. And that's where me as a non-native historian, I don't want to say if these individuals are necessarily good or bad. I think that's for communities to decide about their own culture. I basically just wanted to gather what information I could and say, this is what these people did. It's fascinating. They meant to do good things. It hasn't always turned out that way.
Mhm. Thank you so much for this. If I could abuse my host power and ask a question,
Sure.
I'm just so intrigued by this Madame Tuna's
Yeah, she's
Grand
something.
Opera, and I had not encountered it at all. And I wonder if I could ask you about this space and how much of it is this sort of portrayal of stereotypes of Native people, and how much of it sort of might continue like a Eurocentric, um, I guess, sort of assimilation, because
Yeah.
they're singing Verdi.
Yeah, it's really all over the place. And Phil Deloria, who I'm sure many people are familiar with him and his works, but wrote the book Playing Indian, and he points out that a lot of people previously had kind of looked at the Wild West performers, specifically the native performers, as fitting this stereotype of being subjugated and confined to these roles, and essentially that they were victims. And Phil Deloria battles against that and says, no, these people were, with what space was available, were still able to talk about their cultures in certain ways, but they also kind of led this assimilationist mindset that the audience is expected. And that's in Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, but it's in Mademoiselle Tuna's. And unfortunately, it's what Florence and Lewis also had to do. I just think their example is the most striking when they're Tlingit from Alaska and they're dressed
Yeah.
as Plains Indian clothing. Um, yeah, I'm not sure if I answered that well.
No, you did. It was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Just absolutely fascinated, but we'll talk more, I hope, about it.
I just want to add one final thing about Richard Davis that, again, he was the one that I'm fascinated by, who was at Carlisle the longest and then later is on vaudeville and doing some of the earliest Western films. He actually marries Mademoiselle Tuna, who is non-native, but was his like music instructor and manager when he also worked for her Grand Indian Opera Company.
Yeah.
And they ended up living in Santa Monica, and he created an aid society for other Native American performers living in Southern California. It's really fascinating, but all of the lives they've led are complicated and problematic and from today's perspective. But again, I want to stress that they all were doing the best they could for their communities at the time.
Yeah. All
So
right.
I know we're at 5.
I have taken us to 5 o'clock. So, thank you all for such a fantastic discussion. And if you will all join me in thanking again Nathan Sowry for being here and sharing his fantastic book and research with us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it. Now
And thank
I
you
need
for the
to.
discount code. That is so
Oh,
awesome. I
Yes,
hope
that is
everybody
clutch.
uses the discount code.
yeah, that's
40%
Buy the
important.
book.
off an academic book.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for being here, Nathan.
Mhm.